All right, cool. Yeah, between PowerPoint and cordless mics, a lot of ambivalence there. All right. I had this thing clipped on, and now I got to find another place to clip it on. All right, there we go. No more from me this morning about technology. Okay. So anyway, as I was saying, you all, and I have participated remotely, but you all have been spending your last couple of class sessions getting into this subject of the subject that goes by various names. Sometimes we will refer to it as the problem of evil, or the problem of pain, or theodicy, that Greek word that refers to our efforts to justify or to give into or to explain the ways of God and God's justice toward His creation. You all have talked about various ways we might look at the question of evil. And all of this, as I understand it, is weaving us toward, first, a discussion of the prophet Habakkuk. And so what I want to do this morning is provide you with an introduction to Habakkuk and to some of the text itself, although we will allow Perry in the coming weeks to get more into the weeds than this class session will do. Just by way of administrative matters, most of you will have this question sheet by now. I know it was emailed out. I assume there are copies out back, but this is primarily for Wednesday night, this coming Wednesday night. If you haven't already seen it, you can take a breath. We're not going to get into these questions and answers today, but I just wanted to point this out to you for this coming Wednesday night. And as I understand it, Perry is going to be back on Wednesday, so this is what he'll be talking about. And as you get into that list of questions, what you will see there is that Perry is going to kind of focus on Habakkuk. It looks like not so much the text itself, but just kind of bringing Habakkuk together with what he's talked about so far with the problem of evil. But anyway, hopefully what we do this morning will get you into the text. These questions, I think, assume that you have read Habakkuk. So just kind of be aware of that too. Habakkuk is a short book, 3 chapters, according to the way that we break it down. So it shouldn't take you long to read, but these questions do assume that you have read it. All right. So as I said, what we want to do this morning is more by way of introduction. We're going to talk about some of the things you would typically talk about in an introduction to a biblical book. We have been out of the Old Testament for a while with the study we were doing last quarter. So part of what we'll do this morning is get ourselves back into an Old Testament mindset and kind of think about some of the issues that we encounter when we look at any book of the Old Testament, background, things like that. Toward the end, I hope we'll spend some time looking more closely at specific texts in Habakkuk. All right. The only thing PowerPoint is good for is images. So I like to make sure I include some when I put together a PowerPoint. This is a Russian icon from the 18th century. No reflection necessarily on what Habakkuk actually looked like. We don't know that, of course. But anyway, something to give you a little bit of visual interest, a little bit of visual focus there. So what we want to start off with is who was Habakkuk? What do we know about him? And the answer is not much. Verse 1 of chapter 1 says this: the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. That's it. We know that he's a prophet. We are told about him specifically. We are told essentially nothing else. We've got some theories. We've got some things that are passed down to us from the traditions of the Jews and the traditions of the early church. Some of these are more plausible than others, but I thought I'd present you with a few of them. One thought that we have is that perhaps he's a Levite. And that is drawn from, once you read this book, you will see some familiarity on his part with temple worship, music, the music of the temple, things like that. So it was thought pretty early on that he might have been from the tribe of Levi. Maybe. Another thought, again, we're trying to, you can see the motivation here. We're trying to find Habakkuk in the Old Testament narrative. And so one pretty early idea is that Habakkuk was the son of the Shunammite woman that's mentioned in 2 Kings 4. And if you want to flip over there, 2 Kings 4. This is a story that you know. This is the Shunammite woman that the prophet Elisha stays with. She has a son, of course. Excuse me. Or eventually has a son as a result of her encounter with Elisha. In verse 16, she's having a conversation with Gehazi, who is a servant of Elisha's. And Gehazi says, at this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. The name Habakkuk is related to the Hebrew verb that means to embrace. So there's your connection. That's where we get that. Take that with a grain of salt. If you want to make an argument for it, great. I'm not as wild about that as I am the Levite idea, but there you go. And then one last one. You will notice in Habakkuk 2, verse 1, that the prophet says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower. This led some of the early interpreters to connect Habakkuk with the watchman that is mentioned in Isaiah 21, verse 6. I give that one the same kind of credibility rating as this idea about the Shunammite woman. But again, do with that what you will. I think the overall point here is that we don't know a lot about this guy. And what we do know kind of has to be surmised from the text. And when we start surmising things, we can't be exactly certain. All right. Now, what we do know a lot more about are the times in which Habakkuk lived. But actually, before we do that, I want talk about something here. So we've said that Habakkuk, of course, is a prophet. That is the only description that we get of him at the opening of this book. But what we're also going to see in Habakkuk is that Habakkuk is a psalmist. How many of you have already read this book in preparation for what we're doing? Okay. Well, what you will have noticed is that chapter 3 of Habakkuk, the closing portion of Habakkuk, is a psalm. Everybody see that? Maybe not everybody, but those of you who did read Habakkuk. Once you've read through chapter 3, you're going to see some things. You're going to notice that Habakkuk is familiar with the conventions of psalm writing. Take a look at chapter 3, verse 1. It is called a prayer here, a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to Shigionoth. That reference to Shigionoth, if you go back, if you hold your finger there, you go back to Psalm 7. Psalm 7. And you're going to want to look at the, in your Bible, this will not be included in the verses usually, but it's the superscription to the psalm, the title to the psalm. You'll notice that Psalm 7 is referred to as a Shiggaion of David, which he sang to the Lord concerning the words of Cush, a Benjaminite. So a Shiggaion, which is the singular, or a Shigionoth, which is the plural, what these probably refer to are laments or dirges or very sad songs that are songs of mourning, songs of lament. Back to Habakkuk 3. If you, as you kind of scan with your finger down through Habakkuk 3, you're going to see that notation, Selah, which you see in the Psalms. We don't know exactly what that is, but most seem to think that's some kind of musical direction. Perhaps it indicates a pause where there would have been the music of stringed instruments inserted into the song. And then lastly, notice the very end of chapter 3. Very end of chapter 3, this phrase, to the choir master with stringed instruments. You will have encountered that in the Psalms as well. Specifically, if you look at Psalm 4, if perhaps you're still over there, Psalm 4, the superscription to Psalm 4 reads almost identically. To the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. So again, Habakkuk is familiar with the conventions of psalm writing, and that's what we have here. We have a psalm. He's also familiar with, let's say, the themes of the Psalter. In chapter 1, verse 2, right after we get out of the introduction, notice the first question that Habakkuk puts. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? That how long is going to appear lots of places. Let's look at a couple of them. Psalm 13. Psalm 13. When you get over there, Jared, would you mind reading Psalm 13 for us? And then one more place, Psalm 89. Psalm 89. Psalm 89, verse 46. This is a much longer psalm. We will not read the whole thing, of course. How long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? Perry may have gotten into this already, but I think what we see here, both in these psalms and in Habakkuk, is kind of the classic statement of the subject of this entire quarter. As we're going to see in Habakkuk, Habakkuk is concerned with the wickedness that he sees around him. He is concerned with the fact that it is the wicked who seem to prosper, who seem to be doing great. And this is a concern for the psalm writers as well. In this quarter, we're going to be focusing on Habakkuk. We'll talk about Job. But keep in mind that there are other places in Scripture where this question is raised. And Habakkuk points us to that right at the outset. So let's pause here for a moment. We have talked about, at this point, what we know about Habakkuk. As I mentioned to you up there, to kind of go back to that first screen where we posited that Habakkuk might be a Levite, remember that as you read through the Kings and the Chronicles, as you look at those headings to the Psalms, remember that it's the court musicians, it's the temple musicians who were drawn from the tribe of Levi. And that's again, the most plausible of those theories. Is that Habakkuk might be might be a Levite, given his familiarity with all this with all these things. Comments so far, thoughts so far about. We're trying to squeeze this book in terms of what it tells us about Habakkuk, and that's about the limit of it. Right. Unfortunately, I think oftentimes we don't, we're not as steeped in Old Testament as maybe we could be. And you're right that somebody who first heard these words would immediately make these connections and would kind of immediately know where we're at and the subject that we're dealing with and the problems that we're raising. I don't know. Hopefully all that was helpful to you. Hopefully that kind of sets sets the table a bit as far as who Habakkuk was, what we can say about him. What we can say a lot more about, though, are the times in which we lived. Now, lest you think that we are going from one snooze-worthy topic to another, I have a map. We'll come to that map here in a second. But what we want to do with this is basically to say that we, even though we don't know much about Habakkuk himself, he tells us enough that we can pinpoint him in terms of the history of Judah and Jerusalem. We can know, within a pretty narrow range, where he's at and what's going on. So to review a little bit of this with you all, and for some of you who have been studying the Bible for quite a while, hopefully this will be familiar. Toward the end of the 8th century, around the year 722, the northern kingdom is captured, is destroyed by the Assyrians. Everybody with me? And the northern tribes are taken off into captivity, not to be heard from again. They are, as we said, they are the victims of the Assyrians, and this is a time period over the next century or so. This is the height of Assyrian power and Assyrian dominance. This map will show you a little bit of that. That kind of darker green portion represents the Assyrians at their earliest, quite a bit before they took the northern kingdom. But then by the year 671, after they had taken the northern kingdom, they have expanded all the way out to include that kind of lighter green section as well. I don't think I have a laser pointer on this, but remember, of course, that you can kind of locate yourself by looking for Jerusalem and Judah. Judah, we sometimes forget because it is the subject to Jerusalem and Israel, it's subject of the Old Testament. We sometimes forget that when we're talking about the politics of this area and the history of this area, that this is a small kingdom. And they pretty much, in terms of throwing their weight around, they don't have a lot of that. And so whether we're talking about the Assyrians or the Egyptians, they are pretty much at the mercy of what those empires and their armies are up to at any given time. To back up a bit, when we're thinking about 722, when we're thinking about the northern kingdom being taken captive, the northern kingdom had been prosperous for a very long time. And one of the reasons that they had been prosperous is that there was no aggressive major power on the scene for, let's say, a century before that point. But then once Assyria was up and running, once they were hungry for land and hungry to go after other people's land and other people's wealth, there was not really anything that a Samaria or a Judah or a Phoenicia could do about that. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, that's the northern kingdom. So we go on for about another century, down to, let's say, the 620s. And by the 620s, Assyria is into decline. After about the year 625, Assyria enters its terminal stage, let's say. And this, of course, happens in this period. Empires rise and empires fall, and sometimes that happens very quickly. Assyria expanded way out, and then as time went on, they are going to meet their end at the hands of the Babylonians. Habakkuk is going to refer to the Babylonians. If you'll look at Habakkuk 1:6, Habakkuk is going to refer to the Babylonians as the Chaldeans. And at this point, they are ruled by Nabopolassar, who is also mentioned elsewhere in Scripture. But anyway, This is a tale as old as time. Kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. To borrow another cliched statement, power abhors a vacuum. So when one empire falls, there's always going to be somebody else waiting in the wings to come after them. In this case, it's Babylonia. Let's see. Now, to give you a couple more dates here, 604, this is the decisive end of Assyria, battle at a place called Carchemish, which is in Turkey, basically. Nabopolassar dies, and finally a name you might recognize, his son, Nebuchadnezzar, comes to the throne. And again, we're back to sort of more familiar dates, more familiar events. 6, 7, 8 years later, we get, sometimes we forget that the exile took place in 2 waves. We get a first wave around 598, 597, where the king at that time, Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, and let's say the elites in Jerusalem, the nobles in Jerusalem, are taken into captivity. And then about 10 years after that, after playing cat and mouse with Babylonia for a little bit longer, Nebuchadnezzar decides that he's done, comes in, levels the city, levels the temple, and the rest of the population goes into exile. Questions about any of that? Sometimes, sometimes we see Judah trying to mix it up with these bigger powers like Egypt. God will from time to time condemn his people for seeking alliances with whether it be Egypt, Babylon, Syria, whoever. So yeah, they're in there from time to time, trying to mix it up, trying to hang with the big dogs, and that doesn't always work out for them. Yeah. Nabopolassar was a Babylonian as well. He's the guy who's responsible for finally conquering Assyria, for finally bringing Assyria to its end as a functioning state. All right. So the reason we go into all this is because Habakkuk is going to tell us specifically, God himself, through Habakkuk in verse 6, says, "Behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans." So in other words, we can kind of pinpoint Habakkuk's prophecy to this late 7th century period where Assyria is on the decline and Babylon is in the ascendancy. So that really helps us kind of understand what's going on with this book as a whole. It also tells us, gives us a sense of who's around at the time that Habakkuk was doing this, his prophesying. We can see him as a contemporary of certain other prophets, like Jeremiah, like Zephaniah, like Nahum, and depending on how we date Joel, maybe Joel too. All of them are active in this same period, toward the end of Judah's history as an independent kingdom, toward the end of, in those 30, 40 years, let's say, before the exile, before the destruction of Jerusalem. All right. Thoughts on? Yeah, Jared. At a certain point, it is no longer about turning back. It's about here's what's going to happen. And yeah, we see that in God's answer to Habakkuk's first kind of set of questions in chapter 1. So let's look at that real quick before we jump into. Well, actually, yeah. Let's just this will help us. Habakkuk is pretty easy to outline. Not real complicated as far as that's concerned. Chapter 1, verse 1 gives us our title, basically, our superscription, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. And then we immediately go into this first back and forth between Habakkuk and God. Verses 2, 3, and 4 are Habakkuk's questions. And then verses 5 down all the way down through 11, this is God's first answer to Habakkuk. Then we're going to get a second set of questions from Habakkuk, starting at chapter 1, verse 12, going down through chapter 2, verse 1. And then the Lord is going to answer again, chapter 2, verse 2, down through chapter 2, verse 5. And that's going to end kind of that back and forth. Then we're going to go into a section of woes. Everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say woe. Yeah. We're going to go to a section of woes against the Chaldeans, against the Babylonians, that is. And then lastly, like we saw a few minutes ago in chapter 3, Habakkuk is going to respond to all of this with a prayer, with a psalm. And I don't know, I think some of that's going to remind you of the later chapters of the book of Job, but that's just me. Let's get into chapter 1 in the few minutes we have remaining. And as we read this, I want to point out a couple of things to you. Notice the way the book begins. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. And I want you to think here about verbs in this chapter, verbs of seeing, of vision, of sight. They're going to show up a lot in these first two exchanges between Habakkuk and the Lord. And I want you to kind of pay attention to how they're used and what's going on with them. Let's get some readers. Carolyn, would you like to read? Let's do chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 1, verse 4. So again, we get those themes of the wicked are prospering, bad things are happening, and they're not being corrected. Injustice is happening, and it's not being dealt with. So you might think that God would answer those questions directly, but that's not what's going to happen. Grant, do you want to read verses 5 through 11 for us? Yeah, yeah. I love that last section because he's basically saying, doesn't matter what kind of fortress you have, doesn't matter what kind of defenses you have, they're going to flatten you, and then they're going to go on like it really wasn't anything for them to do that. Leon. I think, yeah, there certainly are the Greek oracles, but oracle is also a word that we use to translate kind of some of the visions that the Old Testament prophets have. That actually, the sculptor Donatello. Some of you younger guys might remember him from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The sculptor, the Renaissance era sculptor Donatello, carved a statue of Habakkuk that was intended to rest atop the bell tower in the city of Florence, Italy. It's in a museum now, but that's it. Again, we don't know what Habakkuk looked like, but I like art, specifically like this kind of older art. So I'm going to show it to you at any opportunity I have. But to get back to this idea of seeing and sort of what Habakkuk saw. The oracle isn't really a person in this situation. The oracle is it's the content of what God is showing him. Does that make sense? Jared, do you have something? Us, because what we have in front of us is a printed text, but we've got a lot of visual imagery in this prophet. So that's something that we kind of have to reconcile. So. I was going to go a little further with this idea of sight and seeing, but maybe some other time. Thank you all for your comments, attention. Hope this was helpful, and hope this kind of sets the table for what we're doing Wednesday night.